Good afternoon. I want to thank you all for coming to hear this talk this afternoon. First, I have to thank Dean McKay for the honor. It was unexpected, but greatly appreciated, and for the opportunity to deliver the Convocation lecture to you today. I've thought about this talk for some time. Convocation talks we both looked at the same definition. They're supposed to be motivating, inspirational, and reinvigorating at this time of year. I also felt some pressure to make it somewhat scholarly, so I spent some time going back to the work and the words of some of my favorite scholars. But as events have unfolded in our nation, this talk has gone through many changes and iterations. I've been editing and re-editing. I was editing up until about 40 minutes ago. The events of the last few months, however, led me to the title, Where We Stand. I decided that I did not want to talk about my research per se. My interest in racial identification, experiences of discrimination, how issues of social position and cultural positioning and identification affect mental health and well-being, and later service delivery and perceptions of all of these things are related to a single thing, and that is achieving greater equity in our society. Sometimes it's difficult to explain to people why these things matter. A number of them were drawn from my own experience and the experiences of people that I worked with and served, particularly during my clinical career. Even my work attempting to understand how to best engage communities in the change process, the work that I'm most focused on now, is about what is known, what is shared with the community, who speaks, who decides. And it is focused on trying to think about how to work through this process of change. What does that mean? So of late, I have done less of my clinical work, less of my work on racial identity and experiences of discrimination, and have focused more of my work on community engagement. And so we've got the Community Research Fellows Training Program that I collaborated on with Dr. Melody Goodman, who abandoned me and left me and went back to New York. But we still work together and collaborate because we are also working on my passion, and she's a biostatistician, so more legitimately, this is her passion. But we both have a fascination with measurement, but we've both been concerned about how we help other people to understand why this community engagement work is important, and how do we demonstrate to our colleagues and to other people how to determine when it's working, how well it's working, and what impact it's having. So we actually have acquired a PCORI grant to help us do that, and so one more measurement study under my belt, looking at how we assess community engagement and its real impact for patients, for members of the community. But beyond that, I increasingly think about what I have learned and come to understand, not purely from my own work, but from constantly engaging my work with that from research and evidence in disparate academic disciplines and literature, keeping in mind the relevant ideas and principles that have grown in strength and depth over time. I think that for me, this is at once the most challenging and the most hopeful time in my academic career. Challenging because I observe the social justices that challenge our nation, which we know we'll encounter periodically, but still can be disconcerting. But hopeful because there are so many more people thinking about these issues, doing this research, drawing similar conclusions about direction, and thinking outside the box about how to move forward. So what type of research am I inspired by, am I thinking about? In the last 3 weeks, I have been reading articles by my colleagues that examines how issues such a belief in and the attempt to execute colorblindness in policy and work on varied meanings of race, particularly those that attempt to imply a neutrality of race and a sort of automaticity to race that permits us to control its effects when we encounter it in our society and in our policy making. I now see analyses that are willing to critically examine how research on human behavior from cognitive, social, and political realms square with the arguments of institutions such as our Supreme Court and how they attempt to make judgments about issues that call into question race and class and equity. There's greater willingness to incorporate history to understand why we consider or study certain attitudes or perspectives today. So in thinking through issues of colorblindness, I want to give you an example. We often think about that whole issue as emerging from a statement, one of the most often cited quotes of Dr. Martin Luther King, where people talk about how we will judge people. What's interesting about this is it's the line that comes from his I Have a Dream speech, but King made it very clear in that speech and in interviews subsequent to that he did not believe that a colorblind approach would be sufficient to solve our problems. Those comments, those quotes are the ones that we never hear. We don't talk about and we don't acknowledge. And so I'm often querying what we agree to discuss and what we avoid discussing. I was trained as a clinician, so my training is always to ask, what's not discussed? What is the client not sharing with me? And I always tell people, I take my clinical self with me wherever I go. So no matter what I'm doing, if you are talking to me about one thing, I'm thinking about what won't you talk about? Why aren't we having this part of the discussion? So it's interesting because King even called for programs of restitution to disadvantaged groups. Most people are not aware of that. So the question for me is, why not? Now, the talk that I'm going to eventually get to really hints at why I think this is. For the students, this is not going to be a talk where I tell you at any point what to do, how to do it, or chastise anyone for what they do or do not do. My personality is such that I don't like being told what to do, no matter how innocently people offer their advice. And so I try not to tell people what to do. I don't particularly like that either. The reason is that no one can tell you what your experience is, has been, or will be. Who people are, who we all are, our experiences, past learning, past and current social positioning, are the things that comprise the environment that we inhabit and create the matrix that we work from and within to determine what our actions are going to be and what our reactions are. However, as with everything, there are always consequences. Consequences for standing, not standing, being vocal, not being vocal, authentic or not, caring or not, courageous or not. It requires answering the age-old existential questions. What does it mean to truly live? What gives your life meaning? What is success for you? What will you be known for? And ultimately, where and for what do you or will you stand? I selected Where We Stand as the title of this talk because it gives me free rein to integrate and cover several issues that I think are worth considering as we confront issues today. And the first has to do with perspective. Perspective is just a frame of reference, an approach, a way of looking at things. It's a very simple definition. However, it's sometimes startling the times and situations where we forget that our approach, our interpretation, our frame of reference is simply that, our perspective, one's view of the world, a single view of the world. Perspective is based in part on our experiences and environment, but it is also based on what we pay attention to and how we process and use information. Now, we know as humans we're cognitively quite stingy in the use of our resources. Once we have views of ideas, people, groups, policies, we tend to keep them even if they were formed by jumping to conclusions and have minimal evidence. It is hard to move us once we have formed an idea or an opinion. We forget that we've selectively attended to and processed information, that we may be favoring information that is consistent with what we currently believe, our values, and our social norms. We forget that there are primacy effects. New information has less effect on impressions than earlier impressions. Sometimes there are recency effects. There's the halo effect, or the tendency in impression formation to assume that once a person has positive characteristics or negative characteristics, everything about them is going to follow that general impression and either be positive or negative. There's confirmation bias. We actually seek and remember information that confirms our beliefs and often ignore information that contradicts our beliefs. We develop sets. That is, we see issues and problems in certain ways that we have a difficult time breaking out of without considerable prompting and prodding. Our expectations of others elicit behavior from the other that confirms our expectations, better known as self-fulfilling prophecy, the classic Pygmalion in the classroom study, such that our causal attributions are subject to bias. We judge our own behavior, and sometimes those who we believe to be like us, differently than we judge the behaviors of people we perceive as not being like us. There's fundamental attribution error. We tend to overemphasize personal attributes and causes for the behavior of others and underemphasize personal causes for our own behavior. Defensive attributions are operating, with our tendency to attribute our successes to our efforts and our failures to external causes without extending this generosity and perception to others, including those not like us. Our perspectives are realities that we are creating through a series of biased acquisitions of information in the environment filtered through another series of known and unknown perceptual, cognitive, and emotional distortions and errors. And I'm not going to try to enumerate them all here. And all of us who are engaged in the study of human behavior, behavior change, are aware of all of these laws and principles and how they affect human interaction. We are all subject to these biases and errors, no matter how intelligent or well-educated we are. Although the ability to engage in what we call metacognition and think about the way we think and process gives us a slight advantage. That advantage doesn't mean we actually make use of the knowledge that we have. These perspectives and assumptions often help to seal the fate of those deemed others, particularly over time. Stereotypes and prejudices affect responses to and behavior toward those who are marginalized in society. Members of these communities then have the almost insurmountable task of overcoming the inaccuracies, stereotypes, and prejudices that emerge based on a range of errant information and attributional processing and decision-making tendencies. These tendencies can slow our progress towards social justice and efforts to create change. Now, the tendencies and the biases that I've noted do not operate the same in all cultures. That's a good thing. Attributional biases have been found to operate in actually the opposite direction in some cultures, which we should take as heartening in some respects. These biases and tendencies are not inevitable. Because we know they operate differently in different contexts, we know they are not inevitable. But they require thought and effort to overcome. They require a firm intention to do something differently. We must form a deliberate intention to do better. Our willingness to do so may be some indication of where we stand. Now, I'm going to offer a very different example and take you down a road that people probably are not expecting. So as long as I've been a student in psychology, I've studied Freud and I've heard him critiqued. Now, I have to say, I am not an analytic adherent, and I disagree with Freudian analytic theory, as do most of my colleagues. So the question is, what has Freud got to do with this talk? His legacy is a good example of two factors that I think affect where we stand. So what people know about Freud and analytic thought is often influenced by selective exposure, telling and retelling of a history and the impact of conformity on the decisions that we make at critical junctures. Freud is a study in the failure to consider where we stand. If you read his introductory and new introductory lectures, and I don't expect anyone to have done this or to do this, if you try to read any of his other bits of tedious writing, and he is a tedious writer, you realize a few things. One, psychoanalytic theory changed several times within the same text. You can read it and it keeps changing and evolving. While this makes testing the theory difficult, it explains a lot. It allows those using the theory to select what they want to focus on. I hope that's where I'm supposed to be, yeah. That happened in American psychoanalysis, which, if you really look at the two genres of psychoanalysis, is not like European psychoanalysis. But what Freud actually believed about anything is hard to know or discern. For example, Freud did in fact state that women are overly emotional, often depressed, anxious, and hysterical. These comments are part of the reason he's roundly criticized. The problem is that these statements are not a full rendering of Freud's discussion of women in society at the time. What he went on to say was that what he observed in the behavior of women was not unexpected given the societal conditions that women were forced to live through. Startling that that would come from Freud. He noted that women were not permitted to express themselves or explore options and opportunities to develop their interest and potential. There is a usual Freudian obsession with sex, and I mean Freud because most analysts luckily were not as much focused on sex as he was. I also have to say in saying that we owe him a debt because he created some space to discuss sexuality that we didn't previously have. But that's a whole nother conversation that I'm not going to let myself go into today. So back to the story. Freud stated that women's lives as constructed by society at that time would lead anyone to be depressed, anxious, a bit hysterical. And he seemed to feel that a change in social norms, the social norms that dictated women's lives might result in a change in their psychology. So, and if you study his relationships, he was admitting women into the analytic profession and supporting their careers at a time when other academics would not consider doing so and were unwilling to do so. So, who is this man? What is this man? Was he a feminist? My reading of Freud says no, not by any stretch. He was definitely an adherent to the social norms of his time. What does that really make him? He saw injustice and discrimination, and he actually commented on it in his work at a time when others could not see it and did not comment on it. Now, how clearly, publicly, and forcefully he stated what he knew to be problematic is up for debate. It's clear that he protected those women within his sphere, but not outside of it. Was that sufficient? What actual change did Freud seek when considering what he knew? And was the change he saw sufficient? Where, in fact, did he stand? Now, to end this history lesson, Freud is also an example of another tendency, which is conformity. Freud's behavior illustrates how social norms, pressures, and fear of loss of social connections can lead to conformity, even to the extent that we sacrifice our beliefs and our values. Freud is criticized for his articulation of the Oedipal complex, but the origin of that theorizing is rarely discussed. It all began with his early assertion that those entrusted with the care of young children should be monitored for their molestation or abuse of these children. He was roundly criticized for this work. His contemporaries did not believe that abuse or molestation occurred. And given that the data were from his clients, the same stigma around mental health issues that exist today existed then, and so it was easy to dismiss that work, that knowledge, that information. Now, Freud understood he was going to lose his standing in the academic and medical world. He had an ego. I had another story in here about the exchange and the meeting between Allport and Freud, but that's too much, so I pulled that out. But this man had an ego, and he would not risk this and step back from his original statements. So he changed the theory and asserted that his patients were not, in fact, reporting actual experiences, but their dreams and fantasies that were to be interpreted as unconscious material. And so the torturous thinking of psychoanalysis is born. Now, think about it. Where might we be if he had had the courage to stand for what he knew, to stand with the data that he had, and to continue his research and his efforts? Now, this doesn't account for all the torturous thinking in psychoanalysis by any stretch of the imagination, but some portions of it. Freud abandoned the people who trusted their truths to him. He retained his status and his position. Freud's inability to stand against social pressure to care for the most vulnerable was an example of conformity, the poorest example in my estimation. I've always felt that this is a lesson for all who engage in the academic enterprise. What obligations accrue as we gather, analyze, and create knowledge? What are we called to do? Gandhi cautions us on knowledge without character. So given what we know, where do you stand at critical moments? Where do we stand at critical moments? How do we use our knowledge? How do we share our knowledge? Where do we share our knowledge? Is it within these walls, or is it outside where it could possibly make a difference? Where do, and where we will stand at critical moments is related to social norms and pressures toward conformity. Conformity is a feature of human behavior that has received a great deal of attention. It is, as is typical, the discussion of conformity in society is probably overly facile, and I'm not about to try to wade through the literature here. Suffice it to say, we know enough to know that conformity can be produced through social pressure, particularly from powerful others, popular people, attractive or respected others. It is also true that we know something about the disruption of conformity. Conformity can be affected by the size of the group of individuals who are participating, difficulty of the task, ambiguity of the task, uncertainty in the moment. Ambiguity is a feature we should pay particular attention to because it comes up over and over again as we ponder reactions and interactions among people. For example, in the research literature on implicit bias, particularly as it operates in the service delivery system, what we see is that those systems that implement protocols that people have a difficult time deviating from show much less operation of implicit bias than those service systems that leave decision-making solely and continuously to the discretion of the practitioner. Because once uncertainty and ambiguity enter the system, we know that implicit and sometimes explicit biases begin to operate, whether consciously or unconsciously, intentionally or unintentionally. But that work is another long discussion that I elected not to try to get into here. Now, another critical factor is having at least one person who has the courage to stand up for what they know to be correct. Think how far along we might be if Freud had had the courage to stand up during the Victorian era and talk about molestation and abuse. We would be much further in our ability to understand, intervene, and address those issues. Now, I'm going to end this section with a reminder from my favorite African diasporic scholar that probably no one has heard. You can tell I'm into tedium and theory a lot more than probably is healthy. Frantz Fanon, who is a Martinican psychiatrist. And what he said is each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it in relative opacity. Who is the nonconformist? Who stands with the nonconformist as the social pressures mount? Where will you stand? Where do you stand? Anyone with an interest in American musical genres might recognize this W.C. Handy quote. I love quotes, and I like W.C. Handy. Life, and I add learning, is something like a trumpet. If you don't put anything into it, you don't get anything out of it. So, consider your openness to information. What you put in to the equation, the decision-making process matters for where you end up standing. Is there an intent to hear and consider other perspectives? When you work in the community, are you truly listening? Are you simply telling? Is there a willingness to reflect on the identities and experiences influencing your perspective and that of others? What effort are you willing to expend to come to a deeper understanding of not only where you stand, but where others stand? Two of the most fundamental organizing issues in our society today are class and race. And I usually say race ethnicity. That's a long discussion, another one that I'm not going to have here. As you can tell, I have a lot of long discussions. There is empirical work that considers class that demonstrates some interesting things. So I've become a fan. I pick up people that I become fans of their work. I'm currently a fan of the work of Eric Knowles. I think it's interesting. So he's gotten people to put on wearable tech. He's from NYU, so you probably have run across his work. But he gets people to use wearable technology. And the technology has allowed him to track behaviors and responses in real time. Now, one of the findings that I have found intriguing is how social class dictates the extent to which we engage with, involve ourselves with, pay attention to other people. Probably not surprising, people of higher socioeconomic status do not look at others as much, do not make as much eye contact, do not observe the actions and movements of others as much. You know, if you try to think through what that's about, perhaps they don't have to. Others exert much less impact and have less importance in their lives compared to the experiences of those who are low and moderate income. What are the consequences of this lack of engagement? Now, in another instance, a colleague who's another clinician engages in training on cultural competence, racial interaction. He described an experience he had conducting a group exercise to stimulate racial dialogue. He asked participants to imagine themselves in the role of the other. Unexpectedly, there was a revolt. Now, unexpectedly because there's a kind of obedience to authority that we also know operates. So the person leading the work is usually perceived as an authority. And people don't typically question, and they certainly don't typically refuse to do an exercise. But this group of participants said they could not and would not attempt to imagine themselves as African Americans. According to his participants, this was unimaginable. They would never be and could never be African American. This was a useless and unnecessary exercise. But what does it say that one could not imagine oneself in the space, the context, the life situation of a particular group or of another? Consider the comfort that these individuals had to have in refusing. Consider the comfort they seemed to have in the uniqueness of their lives, that they were so different they couldn't imagine someone else's life. The assumptions that were being made that the differences between them and the others in the room were insurmountable. A comfort in knowing and being that they were unwilling to give up, even for a moment, even in their imagination. Now, All of us who do this work have had experiences. I often tell when I'm not in Missouri, because this happened in Missouri, I had a group literally get up and walk out of my talk. You talk about difficult moments. So we share these experiences. It's a way to decompress and gain support, to continue and persevere. But what's instructive is what it says about where we stand. Where we stand affects our perspective, and perspective influences attitudes and stance on issues, particularly those of import and those that shape our policies. Yet on something as fundamental to the U.S. Policy as race or class, we often fail to consider where we stand and why. And this research and these stories depict why merely having people in contact does not break down racial divides. The offered solution, we just have to be in contact. The first one is really education. We have to educate people. And the second one is contact. We just need to be around each other. It's interesting to me how we consider evidence and when we use evidence. All the evidence in social psychology tells us that contact is an overly simplified approach to changing racial, class, or any type of group interaction. We know the active ingredients, and we know that it is difficult to create those. One of the active ingredients that's necessary is some sense of equality. So having people in contact when people perceive themselves to be better than, more important than, or somehow superior to the other, actually has the counter outcome than what you originally intended. And that is, it increases distance rather than closing distance among people. You might facilitate dialogue, but the desired change is highly unlikely. And I can take you through a litany of the things we know about what we should be doing. What's important is that there are many critical issues that we have to tackle in this country. They affect all of us, whether we recognize it or not. However, the introduction of issues such as race, class, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation have become major stumbling blocks to conquering the challenges of a diverse, maturing, free market economy. I have to say it that way because in my Facebook life, I'm sometimes challenged if I don't say that we're not a democracy because we're a republic. We're mention the fact that we're a free market economy, a capitalist society, because all of these things really matter that much. But having done followed the obligation to state exactly what we are in the U.S., we need to ensure that we have some things that we all need to make sure of. And that is that all children receive quality education, that those who work every day earn a livable wage and have safe and affordable housing if we're to continue our progress. But if the interest, presence, or needs of the wrong group are attached to the issue or policy, our ability to or will to act or sustain action seems to be affected. Yes, we value free speech. However, does that value extend to all? So there's new research out by White and Crandall that suggests that when people are endorsing and calling on this fundamental political value, a part of what seems to be happening right now is it's being used to buffer hate speech from normative disapproval. And the meta-analyses of the literature in this area demonstrate that free speech appeals in these instances are usually associated with people high in prejudicial beliefs, and that their advocacy for free speech is curtailed if you're directing that free speech at the police, if you're directing that free speech at their coworkers, or other people they perceive to be like them. So, in essence, what it says is, our calls for free speech need to be monitored to make sure that, in fact, what we're talking about is free speech for all and not just free speech for some. Where we stand in the world dictates the acceptability of free speech, when and how it is to be used. Does Colin Kaepernick have the right to free speech? Now, in my own research, members of every group reported experiences of discrimination at various levels for various reasons. Reports of discrimination are not restricted to any group, a reality that people seem to deny. What does seem to be different in these assertions is how people report experiencing that discrimination, whether it's stressful, whether it produces some impact on their life. And what is interesting is that people who are in positions that we would consider privileged typically report that despite experiencing discrimination, it has not impacted their lives, it has not been distressful for them. And if you continue to monitor their reports over time, that continues, you can get as close. The closest we've been able to get is within 15 days of an incident, did not change. Now, if I have power and I am uncomfortable, I can end the conversation with minimal risk or loss. If I have economic and social support resources, I can seek redress when I recognize situations that seem unfair. If I have none of these things, I have a choice. I can sit quietly and attempt to survive the situation. I can act passively aggressively, or I can act openly aggressively and accept the range of consequences that might follow. What I decide depends on where I stand. So I'm back to Franz Fanon, who said that when considering issues of oppression and justice, change does not mean improvement. Change does not mean reform. Despite the frequency with which we equate change with improvement and reform, it is not a given that all agree and that this is sufficient. For me, the question is whose interest, whose perspective on the adequacy or the state of affairs does this equivalence serve? Whether problem solving, conflict resolution, program planning and intervention, or policy, where do you stand? Where do you, your partners, or others who will be affected stand? Now and historically, ideologically, materially, where do you stand? What do people have? What can they bear to share? What can they bear to lose? What is too little? What is too much to ask? What is too much or too little to do? Over what time? All of those questions depend on where you stand. Perhaps we would do well to engage with the recognition that whether considering family, community, discipline, what seems possible, what we feel we can, what we feel we should, what we will do is affected by where we stand. And these moments of tension and anxiety, does a space exist to share and explore the issues from differing vantage points? Now, as a clinician, I adhere to that belief that things change when there's anxiety, tension, some conflict in the system. People don't readily change when everything is calm and at rest. And as a clinician, I always take advantage of that opportunity. When there's tension, anxiety, that's when you pride. Now, a good clinician knows you have to hear your client and respond to where they are as you seek solutions. Make sure they have the resources and what they need. However, you cannot allow them to settle into or move to a state where everything is calm and rest, because you know you've lost that clinical moment. So too in society. When there is tension, when there is anxiety, when there is conflict, this is the opportunity for change. If we refuse to act, if we allow that moment to dissipate and just move to the calm, steady state, are we giving up that opportunity to produce real change? As I end, I can share what I hope for the Brown students, and that was the reason that I took some pleasure in doing this. What I want to say to you is that you didn't get a joke here, you didn't really get a good story, but I'm finishing up and you got 2 minutes to go. So what I want for you is that you are able to face your greatest fears and risk failure during your time here. As frightening as it may seem some days, this is probably the last safe haven for doing so, and it's an ideal place to figure out where you stand. Find your passion. If you care about it, love it, believe in it, you're going to do it. No one will have to ask, prod, or advise you. Focus on challenging some of your most deeply held beliefs, your way of thinking, and seek new knowledge during your time here. This means you have to be willing to learn from everyone you encounter, not just the faculty, your peers, everyone in this building, everyone passing through this building. No matter what you think of yourself, where you've been, or what you have done, everyone every day has something to teach you if you're willing to learn. Frame your vision so that the interventions, issues, and policies that you work on or that you work to create, the organizations that you work with, the life that you want to have, the world that you want, is available to and that you think about how to help create that for other people as well. Fulfill your unique destiny. Understand that you can stand, particularly once you understand and establish where you stand. I want to thank you for listening to this long and trailing discussion, and good luck to the students and my colleagues as well.